All right.
Now we're live.
Hello and welcome to all our viewers this evening. On behalf of Roanoke College, I welcome each of you to the series, NOKELive from DC. It's Healthcare Night. My name is Brian Parsons, and I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and the Chair of the Public Affairs Department. One of our co-hosts this evening is my colleague, Dr. Shannon Anderson, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and the coordinator of the Public Health Studies program here at Roanoke. This event is co-sponsored by the Office of Alumni and Family Relations, the Public Health Studies program, and the Public Affairs Department. Before we get started, please know that each of you viewing via YouTube can use the chat feature to ask questions of our presenter. Once the presentation is complete, Dr. Anderson and I will select and ask as many of your questions as possible. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available on this YouTube channel for future viewing. A link to our past NOKELive events, as well as other online content, can be found on the Alumni Hub at roanoke.edu/alumni. This evening's NOKELive topic is Healthcare on the Hill. This is actually part 2 of a series with Dr. Rodney Whitlock, a Roanoke College graduate from the class of 1987. Dr. Whitlock has gained over 25 years of experience on the Hill, working in both houses of Congress in the area of healthcare policy. During his tenure, he managed the Patient's Bill of Rights, served as the lead Republican staffer for Medicaid legislation from 2005 to 2010, and helped staff Republicans in the Senate on such prominent and important legislation as the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, Tax Relief and Healthcare Act of 2006, the 2 CHIP Reauthorization Acts of 2007 and 2009, and the Affordable Care Act of 2010. For the last 20 years, Rodney has been an adjunct faculty member at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management, and the Graduate School of Political Management in the Department of Legislative Affairs. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Rodney Whitlock to begin tonight's presentation.
All right. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Shannon, for having us tonight. We're going to second in the series, and thank you all for being here with us. The format that we worked on the first time we're going to continue on is this is something that we're trying to do as a combination of talking about public health and political science, 2 things that I've done since I left Roanoke, and to try to then take those and talk about the careers that people have had, and again, hopefully give you something to help you think about and what you're working on, both out in the real world or for those of you who are still students. My guest tonight is my good friend, Lauren Aronson. Lauren Aronson is one of the most remarkable people I'm fortunate enough to work with, and her career and the places she's been is the stories that come with this is somebody who's been in a lot of cool rooms. So my friend Lauren went to the George Washington University. She worked in the house for this guy named Rahm Emanuel, who I think she can tell you is every bit of the Saturday Night Live skit version of his world. That she then worked with the Obama administration and from the transition team and into the administration, came back to work some in the House of Representatives and then Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. She's been in so many cool places, which is why she's such a great person for us to have here, and only days before the election, because we can talk all about the politics of the moment. So very fortunate to have Lauren here with us. Lauren, thank you for being here. So where we want to start tonight, as we have in the previous, is we'll do some of the public policy type first on the health side, talk about some of the process and the politics of the world and that you and I have lived through, and talk a little bit about how you got to where you are, and the pathway decisions along the way, which particularly for students is always fascinating to hear. So I'll start on the policy side. You and I work together in certain spaces, and one of those is drug pricing. And this is where I'd like to start tonight. It's one of the most prominent issues in healthcare in the public space. And talk a little bit about why does it matter? I mean, how does it come to be that drug pricing has become such an issue here? Oh, Lauren, you're muted.
Okay, I'll start again. It's great to be with you here this evening. Thank you for having me. I'm always happy to talk politics and policy with you, Rodney.
Mm-hmm.
So just starting on where you kind of left off, I mean, I think the issue of drug pricing is one that really has only taken hold in the last couple of years. It's something that, 10, 15 years ago really just was not a major concern. I mean, back then we were talking about things like, expanding CHIP to more children and more parents. We were talking about trying to deal with, providing coverage. People didn't have access to affordable, comprehensive health coverage in the private market. So you're right that for many years, it really was about trying to address some of those more systematic issues across the health system. And when we think about drug pricing, I mean, you didn't have drug prices come to market with the price tags they do now. So I think back to 1989, shortly after you graduated from Roanoke. And at that point, the drug price that had the biggest public outcry had a price tag of around $9,000. And so you fast forward to 30 plus years later, here we are, God, I'm aging, I'm dating myself, 30 plus years later. And we have new drugs coming to market that are seven figures, in the multi-million dollars. So I think the real change has happened really in the last 5 to 6 years. And I think the real catalyst was when Sovaldi came to market, which, from your time in the finance committee, Rodney, you know a lot about. But when Sovaldi came to market, it was really a wake-up call for a lot of consumers and payers and hospitals and physicians to say, oh my God, we have drugs that are coming to market with these price tags and they're unaffordable. And we all want new, therapeutic interventions to come to market, but they're of no use if people can't afford them. So that was really, I think, the catalyst for the larger conversation that we've been having over the last few years.
So, and you're right. I worked on the investigation that Senators Wyden and Grassley did on Sovaldi. And it really was, the marketplace just wasn't prepared for a drug that had in the case of Sovaldi, which was a drug that was that had a tremendous impact. It cured hepatitis C. Cured. It was a cure. And this is a drug where, and I can speak to this personally, both of my uncles had hepatitis C, and they, one of them did go through interferon, one of them went through a liver transplant. Neither of those are particularly good options. And so a pharmaceutical regime is a giant step forward. But when you create a situation where you have a demand and this type of drug and a price set by manufacturers at effectively their discretion, it creates problems within the marketplace.
Sky was the limit. And I think, we saw in based on the investigation, Senator Grassley did, and we really saw that the decision that Gilead had to price the product had no correlation to the investments made or research and development. It really was sky's the limit. So we're going to price it whatever we want to, because we know there's nothing that payers or consumers can do. And that, I think, was really a big challenge. And where we saw it really play out significantly was on state Medicaid programs. That really created some significant issues. And it was so expensive, and there was such obviously a need for it, given its curative nature, that state Medicaid programs actually had to put in place waiting lists, which is not a situation any of us want to be in. And so when you're thinking about how Sovaldi and other drugs are coming online, we have these new drugs that are coming online with significant price tags, but then we also have more mainstream drugs that are having significant price increases throughout the year. And so the means seem like they're small, whether they be 2% or 9%, but they're happening multiple times a year. And so when you compound those, that has a real impact on consumers and also payers. I mean, if you're a hospital, you budgeted for what you're aware the price is at the moment you set your budget. But there are significant prices that occur throughout the year. What are you supposed to do? And so it becomes a really big challenge for providers and consumers and for hospitals.
Well, but then I think for the purposes of our policy conversation, why don't hospitals just increase their prices concurrently?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we are seeing some downstream effects, but really where it comes out to is at least for Medicare beneficiaries and for consumers, they're paying more and more out of pocket. So a lot of it's getting cost shifted onto consumers because hospitals also can't really bear the burden of a lot of these increases.
And for a lot of hospitals and other consumers, they can't when you're in a contract. And this is definitely what we saw in the Medicaid program with Sovaldi, which is if you entered into an annual contract to provide services and a new drug comes on the marketplace and it's very expensive, perfect word, you are locked in. You can't go back and say, excuse me, sir, may I have some more, because this drug came out.
Right. And we've seen situations where hospitals have had to then deter, other investments they were going to be doing in their infrastructure or not hire enough PAs or nurses. So it really does have a downstream impact on what hospitals can do to provide, the vital services to their communities.
And isn't that sort of one of the overarching issues here that creates tension in healthcare with drug pricing? It's the price setting authority that drug manufacturers have that others in healthcare simply do not have. The
Yeah,
ability
absolutely.
to say, this is my price.
Right. No other industry, I think, in the healthcare sector has that ability. I mean, for health insurers, all the inputs to go into setting premiums now, you can only charge so much for different ages. You can't do a significant amount of underwriting. So the parameters are largely there. And same for physicians and for hospitals. It's largely dictated by the government. So the manufacturers are really the only entity that I can think of where the sky's the limit. They can determine whatever price they want because that's the market. So we're thinking about how do you have even a less government-centered approach, but more of a market approach. The reality is the market is broken. And so if we want to get to a more functioning marketplace, we need to kind of address a lot of the systematic abuses that's happening in the industry. So that's one, dealing with patent abuses, two, getting more generics and biosimilars to market, and three, trying to break up monopolies.
So can we talk a little bit about the challenge in talking about value in the space? In that,
well, everyone decides value. Everyone defines value differently, Rodney.
That's where I was going to go, which is, how do we, that we're watching this right now in, very frankly, watching the Food and Drug Administration's, the FDA's reaction to COVID treatments.
Right.
So what is actually considered a valuable treatment versus efficacious, meaning that it does effectively what they say it does, but how much of a difference does it make? That comparative sense that we really lack that in the drug space in any type of, and certainly any relation to pricing, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think there's been a lot of desire to try to do what's called, comparative effectiveness research, where you're trying to compare different drugs and their effectiveness. And maybe one drug would provide a longer lifespan or have just less side effects. So those things are valuable. But again, to our earlier point, how do you determine value? Is it based on, quality of life years? Is it based on, fewer, is it based on fewer side effects and so forth? And so there are a number of inputs to consider. But I think the challenge is that, again, everyone, determines it differently. And I think one thing that's challenging about the value conversation is that that's largely ends up being, from a policy perspective, a discussion between manufacturers and payers. It really doesn't count for consumers, because even if you set up things like value-based contracts, which is where a lot of manufacturers want to go, they want to get paid more based on outcomes. What does that do from a consumer perspective? It's, there's been some conversation of whether or not within the consumer can have a discount as well, but that doesn't quite work. And so there's been a lot of discussion of value is going to solve the problem, but the reality is it may help a little bit here and there if you want to determine whether or not you're actually comparing apples to apples. But beyond that, it's really challenging to do. I can only think of one drug where you can really determine, you can compare the PCSK9 inhibitors, for cholesterol, really gives you a good sense of what the options are and how they are going to be really impactful from a therapeutic perspective for individuals. So, we had Lipitor on the market for a very long time. Lipitor was a very efficacious drug for a large segment population, but there was always a small segment that just didn't respond to Lipitor. So when you have these new drugs come on market, it was great, but then you also had significant price tags associated with them. So we had a couple of other, PCSK9, which is this class of drugs, come to market and create competition. We immediately had, a price drop, which was really impactful.
Yeah, and and trust me, I know as somebody who drops a Lipitor every morning, I'm, appreciate that it works.
Well, I'm glad it's a generic now, and so you're paying pennies on it.
And I'm paying less for it because of that. But another thing that also creates a value conversation, which is it in the manufacturer's interest to have anyone determining amongst 5 or 6 drugs if there is a better one, when we are now in a realm where there are 5 or 6 drugs, and it is ultimately up to the decisions made by prescribers as to which drug it is, as opposed to any other type of entity saying, no, actually, of these 6, this is the 1 or 2. I mean, that also doesn't work to the advantage of a value conversation.
It doesn't. And also, I think it's how you define better. Is better actually dealing with quality of life and life years, or, fewer side effects, or is it just, the drug lasts a little longer in your system? So we're seeing a lot of manufacturers define their drug as better or more valuable because they are repackaging it and doing, formulation. Means instead of taking it 3 times a day, you're taking it once a day. Well, that's helpful, but that doesn't make it more valuable. And so you're seeing a lot of kind of those discussions also happening.
So let's take the obvious answer, which is why don't we do like every other country and just say, well, we'll control the price of drugs? I mean, isn't that the challenge that even this administration said that they wanted to do, which is come up with some of other international pricing index and say, okay, this is what the rest of the world pays, this is what America's going to pay. I mean, why not do something like that?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that if we are starting from scratch, I mean, I think there's something to be said for reformulating kind of how we approach the pricing here. But given where we are, and we kind of saw this through ACA, that's just not the market and not the structure we have in this country. And so the question then becomes, how do you kind of take some lessons learned from abroad and bring them back home? Is it pegging international prices one of them? That's one approach. Sure. There are other approaches too, where you can say, okay, we have these 5 drugs, and we're just going to pay for, and they're all therapeutically equivalent. We're just going to pay the price for the cheapest one. And then if you want something more expensive, then you as a consumer pay more than that. So, I mean, there are a variety of ways to change it. But to get back to your original question, I think the challenge is, do we want to all of a sudden base our pricing based on other countries? I mean, I think it's a valid question. I think people will question. I think we've heard that there have been questions about the way the other governments have structured their programs. And I think there's some value there. Of course, that's how I define value. But, I think that's certainly a conversation that we've been having as a country, and, we'll continue to.
Right. And I just want to, just before I sort of want to shift to the other next segment of our conversation here, just a quick conversation about insulin. I mean, insulin is arguably one of the most prominent drugs for the purpose of these conversations, because you have to have it. And that connection, the demand of the marketplace is inelastic. Right. You have to have it or else. Right. And so the price sensitivity there that consumers face is terrifying, right?
Right. And for insulin, it's one of those drugs that's been on the market, I think, since the 1940s. Mm-hmm. We've seen significant price increases. We have a huge diabetic population. And then I think the other challenge also is that there's also no generic. People always think that insulin is generic. It's not. It's actually dominated by 3 brand new manufacturers. And so that really creates a very challenging dynamic as to how do you create competition. Again, we all know what the inputs are for insulin, but because of the way our patent system and other structures are in place from a regulatory perspective, there's no pathway now for a generic version of insulin to come to light. It is something that Congress debated through the Health Committee process. You may remember, Rodney. So there are some bills that kind of would try to set up that framework as some of the generic manufacturers are trying to create a biosimilar. But it's a very challenging dynamic right now.
So there's a public policy conversation on the drug pricing. We then also part of this conversation, for particularly the folks in the public affairs, political science side, want to talk about how process works. And goodness knows this is something you've been around for a while. And as you well know, you and I go back many a moon when you were a child prodigy on the Hill.
15 years ago, to be honest.
I know. When you think about some of the stops on your career, because of how you have been in so many different places, how does the different hats you wear, being either in leadership in Congress, working prominently on a committee in Congress, and then, of course, being in the administration, both in the White House and in the lead regulatory agency, how does that different hat change, how you affect your job? Or are you the same Lauren either place?
No, I mean, I think, well, one, you're kind of the same person either place, but obviously with every experience, you're taking on a new skill set, a new perspective. So I think I'm much more effective in the job I am now because of all those experiences. I think it makes me a more effective lobbyist because I was always, and this too, we were on the receiving end of the incoming. So I know what are effective arguments, how to portray them. And then when you're having a larger debate, thinking also about politically about drug pricing, it's not just about a one-on-one policy conversation. It's largely about, you think about it as a political campaign. So earlier on in my career, even before I got to policy, I did opposition research for people who were running for Congress. And so I think that my, those brass tacks political skills have certainly kind of helped, in everything I've done since then.
Yeah. So you were on, you were in the administration for the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So you were working on getting it passed from the inside of the administration.
I was there from day one.
How much fun was that, particularly trying to you know, I believe that the president's got a memoir coming out that's going to be talking about a lot of rooms I was in, talking about, you know, how did they, you know, get the Senate to move along, get the House done. I mean, how much of a challenge was it from where you sat during these conversations?
Well, I'd say, I mean, obviously it was an incredible honor to work for President Obama and work in the White House at the early part of the administration and kind of stay till the end of a few months past when the ACA became law. And obviously the ACA was the highlight, you know, of my career. And definitely had many very special moments with the president, especially, you know, after the passage. But I will say it was hard. And you know that we had so many conversations throughout the course of the time, you know, how are we going to, you know, bridge the policy gap and bridge a political gap? I think it started off really challenging given how, you know, Leader McConnell said from the beginning that he was going to try to block everything President Obama was going to do. We were also dealing with economic downfall. You know, we had obviously a major recession in 2008 going to 2009, so we had to deal with that. So it was a really challenging time. And there were 15 million times where I thought we were dead in the water. We really did. I mean, I can't recall how many times I went home and I was like, oh my God, we're done. We're done. It just died. And then it kind of came back to life every couple of days. And so that was one of the, I think, life lessons is like, it's never over until Fat Lady has sung, you know? And so I really do think that the president personally gets an immense amount of credit for continuing to push. Every time members of Congress were getting tired and wanted to walk away and we couldn't see a path forward, he just kept saying, we have to do it, we have to do it, we have to do it. And I think it was really truly under his leadership and Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid that ultimately, you know, got us to the place where we got it done. But that said, you know, AC is not perfect. I would never argue it's perfect. And there's so many things I wish we could have done differently or things that, you know, we could have had a chance to improve upon the last 10 years. And it's just been very challenging now as an outsider to see how hard it's been to make any changes to make the law, you know, just benefit more people.
Yeah. And from there, you went to the Ways and Means Committee, as I recall.
I did. So this is where my ROM stories get fun. So
Yeah.
I'll tell one where one thing about, you know, I feel like for every job you have, you really want to think about what you're taking from that job and for your skill set that's going to help you in your next career. And I felt like my time in the White House was incredible. I mean, obviously, I have no complaints whatsoever. I was just incredibly lucky and honored. And so much about Washington is just working hard and being in the right place at the right time. And I was just, you know, very honored and very lucky to be able to have the opportunity. But I realized that I was going from, you know, my job in the White House was, you know, working with Congress and trying to get the legislation done. Then I was meeting with stakeholders constantly. I had a weekly meeting where I had to go get yelled at from groups on the progressive side that we weren't doing enough on the public option. So I almost was like walking into a room and having tomatoes thrown at me. And so kind of working through that process. And then, you know, briefing. I had to brief the press secretary every day before he had to go brief the White House press. And then I would get pulled into meetings with my old boss, Rom, who was chief of staff at that time. So there's a little bit of, you know, a fixer, jack of all trades, which I loved and enjoyed because, Rodney, you know, I'm a fast talking New Yorker and I get bored super quickly. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But I realized through all of my experiences that I really wanted to drill down and become a subject matter expert, not just in healthcare, but in one specific issue area. And so when I was thinking about how best I could do that after the ACA became law, I decided I loved the Hill and it never gets old and I wanted to go back. And Rom called me to his office and thought I was crazy. But I said, this is what's best for me and I know myself and I'm going to go do this. And he said, okay. And I did. And you know what? Even though we lost the House a few months later, I'm so glad I did it because it made me realize that I always wanted to work in a committee and I'm so glad I did. And it was a phenomenal experience. But that said, it was a great learning experience for me because I realized I actually kind of got bored just focusing on one issue area all day long. And I liked instead working across multiple healthcare areas. And so that was, you know, it was a good life lesson for me.
Do you think that you would have had a different experience if you spent more time in the majority there?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Potentially.
You know, that's, I mean, in the House, let's be honest, being in the minority in the House is a lot less fun.
Sure, a lot less fun. And I was but I was defending a law that I care so deeply about. Right. But I also feel like, you know, I would have definitely stayed public. I mean, I was there a little shy of 2 years. I had no intention of leaving. I was hoping we'd take back the majority, but then, you know, it was over Thanksgiving And all of a sudden my phone rings and it's, when anyone from the White House calls you, the area code is just 202 and there's no other numbers. And so I looked down at my phone the day before Thanksgiving. I'm like, why is the White House calling me? And it was White House presidential personnel saying, hey, so this job is open as the head of Ledge at CMS and people put forward your name. And I was like, what? So, but again, sometimes it's being in the right place, right time and working hard. And at the end of the day, this Washington is a relationship town, people town. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you're not a good person or you're not good to work with, you're not going to get very far. And so I think I've really tried to pride myself in how I treat all people, but also, it was incredibly more important professionally in Washington that you treat everyone well and with respect and you're well liked. It definitely creates more opportunities.
So we can talk about that job shift. So the phone rings, they tell you they have an opening at CMSOL, and your reaction is, wait, I thought you people liked me. Why would you want me to take that job?
I loved it, actually.
Yeah, so now you have then been in leadership in the House with Rom, who I'll say openly, in every dealing I have with him, I enjoyed every moment I spent with that guy.
I did too, actually. I'm
certain, you have stories.
I did actually. I did. People always,
wonderful at how he treats people.
People think that he is scary, and he pushed me, no question. I mean, but I was a better staffer for it.
Yeah.
And we were actually emailing a little bit before the pandemic and kind of talking about that. And he was laughing when I told him that. I really felt like he made me a better staffer. He definitely challenged me and pushed me, but always did it with, nothing but respect. And on a personal level, I just, always adored him.
So you work in the House leadership, you go into the White House, you come back into the House now in the committee to do substance, and now you go into the belly of the beast, the actual bureaucracy, into the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and a very special office, the Office of Legislation, whose job it is to interact with the 535 folks in Congress. And you're the only political there, as I recall. Everybody else is make sure you all understand the difference. There are people who get their job through the merit system, applying through USA Jobs, etc. And then there are people who are appointed because they are part of the political team. You are the one political in that office. So again, you're in a different world at that point.
Well, I needed a challenge. I mean, no job is fun if you're bored.
That's true. So how then is that transition to that role? And again, knowing that you're dealing with a Republican majority whose sole job is just to be difficult to you.
True. I was lucky though when we took it, at least the House was, the House was Republican, the Senate was still under control of Democrats.
That's true.
But it didn't actually really change that much. You would think the interactions would have been a little bit different, but they weren't. I loved it. I actually think working at CMS was such a fascinating agency. I learned more, I think, in my 3 years at CMS than I did in many other of my jobs. There's just something to be said, particularly for in healthcare, about really understanding how the process works. And my respect and admiration for so many of the civil servants who work at CMS is just, sorry, I apologize. One of my children is likely to walk in at some point. Really just beyond. Hold on, Sarah, can you get in?
Logan, I see just came in.
Thank you. Just got booed by our neighbors, so my 6-year-old. With no trick or treating, they're getting booed from our neighbors.
Yeah.
So what I say about CMS is that it was really just a phenomenal experience, and I loved actually understanding really how the process works. And really just getting to work with some civil servants who understand these programs and really are coming at it from a perspective of just trying to do what's in the best interest of the Medicare beneficiary and thinking about the trust fund. I know that obviously a lot of bureaucrats get a really bad name for sure, but to be honest, there's a reputation that they don't work hard and yada, yada, yada. I'd say that 99.9% of anyone I interacted with at CMS cared deeply and worked incredibly hard. And it was just a really enjoyable experience. I learned a ton from them. The political side is always challenging when my job was to work with friends like Rodney, but then also get, members of Congress calling and yelling at me for a variety of issues, or members of Congress who just want to talk through issues. I remember one of my last days before I left, it was, I think it was Christmas Eve, and I spent 45 minutes actually on the phone with a little known member of Congress named Mark Meadows. He's now the White House Chief of Staff because he wants to talk through a policy issue. And we had, despite our political differences, a lovely substantive conversation. At the end of the day, just had to agree to disagree. But of all the members I actually talked to, he was probably one of the few who didn't hang up on me. I had many Democrats who hung up on me upset about various things that they wish we'd done differently and vice versa. But, it's a challenging dynamic at the time, but it just really added to the experience.
So I think I've got this right, but correct me if I'm wrong. You were also there during healthcare.gov.
I was. That was very challenging. It was very challenging.
How do you, how hard is it, again, in terms of, I don't want to say it's a personal integrity thing, but it's also just an ownership thing where you so much want things to be right, and yet it was such a hard start.
It was.
How do you work through? I mean, you just can't, wish it to be better, and everybody just has to work through it. And
yeah, I mean,
you are the center of incoming for that.
Yes, it was a very challenging time, and the weeks leading up to it were challenging too, because we kept knowing it was not going to be pretty, but no one knew it was not going to work. And I think that was a really, it was a very trying time. It was a very trying time, and on top of it, we had oversight, we had hearings. There were several of us who were pregnant. I was very pregnant at the time, and I remember our CMS administrator, who's also from Southern Virginia, was Marilyn Tavener, who I adore deeply. She had to go testify in Capitol Hill multiple times, and we had press in front of us so much that they were like physically got in front of me, and I was pregnant, and it was not a great time. Let's just say that. But at the end of the day, it was a really challenging couple of months. But the CMS staff really did right the ship pretty quickly, along with a lot of outside incredible help from key folks in the White House, and obviously a lot of people on the outside who were just experts in the area, and said, let us come help you build a website. And we said, of course, please come help us. Some of the challenges had to do with the reason why we didn't have the right people helping us set up the website and the back end systems is because we were limited by some of the way the federal procurement works in terms of which contractors you can use. And none of those had the experience we needed for like an Amazon or Google or, even in eBay, any of those entities which do these things so quickly. And so being able to then we them in later on to really just fix something pretty quickly, it was pretty much up and running, although it felt like a really long time. The launch was in October of 2013. We kind of wrote the ship by Thanksgiving. And so it felt forever, but it was actually working within a few weeks. But it was definitely, a very challenging time. And I'll say that when I finally took maternity leave, it was a blessing. About being months old with an infant.
Yes. So just really quickly for the audience, the CMS administrator she was referring to is Marilyn Tavener. And for those of you local, you know that she did her nursing school training at Roanoke Memorial Hospital. I think it's still called that, and if I'm not, correct me. But
I don't think it is anymore. But
yeah, I know. So the joke was, she worked in the hospital I was born much later. So now talk about though, because this then does talk about moving into that side of the world where, the challenges in getting the website up and running and everything. It does speak to the challenges, lack of a better way of putting it, of a bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That you were constantly running into the challenges and rules of the bureaucracy that led you to that point. One of the most, and again, I always really respected and enjoyed Marilyn's company, but one of the most difficult moments I had to watch was, her having to testify that, she's the one that actually made the call that, we'll go forward without a browse function. Which is the equivalent of saying, I'm going to go to Amazon and I'll let them put it in my cart and then I'll decide whether or not I want it. So hard to keep moving forward when that the rules are pushing you in a direction where it's just not working.
Right. But again, still thought that people were going to be able to sign up, which was the most critical thing. And so from our perspective, we were still wanting to figure out a way to provide people access to getting coverage. The fact that it would actually physically not work was just not something anyone ever contemplated, because everything we had been hearing was that, yes, it's not going to be pretty, but it's going to work.
Yes, it's cool. Yeah, it's yes, that nobody actually, we're talking about the iceberg. It was,
right.
We'll get this together.
And I think there's something to be said then about what the policy expertise is and what the technical operational expertise is. And I think that where CMS has, a ton of value add. I mean, it's on both fronts, but I think they're clearly policy experts. But I think when you're thinking about technology, obviously the private sector is much further along in so many different aspects of technology than the federal government is, and that's across the board. And this was, unfortunately, a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So we'll open up Q&A here in a few minutes, but usually about this part, I like to turn to sort of a pathway thing. Now, as part of this, we've been discussing this, we've pretty much sketched out your pathway and how you got here. But I mean, what were some of the decisions where, so just to give you who we had on the last time, Seth Gold, who works with Senator Rob Portman. And Seth tells the story of his break was not getting a job working for me, because
that was one of my breaks too, was not getting a job, not for Rodney, of course. Yes. That's for a Democrat.
And how that then I referred him to somebody else who he did get a job from, and then that led him on the rocket ship to where he is now. I mean, what are some of those moments where, a right direction ended up pushing you forward?
Well, I mean, there are several, actually. I think that earlier in my career, as I noted, I did opposition research and worked for folks who were running for office. And so one of the last race I worked on, which is going to show how old I am, was actually in 2002, when Erskine Bowles was running against Elizabeth Dole for Senate. Erskine Bowles, former Clinton chief of staff. And so I got to know a lot of the former Clinton staff because of Erskine. And I realized I liked politics, but I was kind of getting tired of moving around the country. And to be honest, every Democrat I worked for kept losing. So I felt like for the sake of the party, I should try something else. And I was just generally always very interested in healthcare policy. So I got connected with someone named Chris Jennings, who was Clinton's healthcare advisor, also served in the White House with President Obama. And originally he was like, come be my assistant. And I was like, oh, I'm 24. I don't want to come be your assistant and schedule your meetings. And he said, trust me, you will learn a ton. You'll get to write memos. You'll learn everyone who's decision maker on Capitol Hill. And I'm so glad I did, because my gut reaction was no. And I'm glad I really gave it a lot of thought. And I said, okay, I'll go do this, even if it meant that I had to spend 15% of my time scheduling his meetings. I still learned so much from being his number two and working with him. And we spent, going into the 2004 presidential election, we advised every Democrat up until the end when Senator Kerry was the nominee on their health plan. So I got to help draft and work on every Democratic candidate's healthcare plans then. And he was such a resource, and still is, to members of Congress and staff, that I got to meet and know everyone. And that was really just an incredible experience. I think that was one of them. And then my second actually is when I really wanted to go to Capitol Hill after I worked for Chris. I was down to being a health advisor for a guy who's named, oh my God, it's escaping me. He was a congressman, Democrat from Arkansas.
Marion Barry?
No, not Marion Barry. The other one who's a pharmacist. I cannot remember his name now. He was a blue dog.
Huh, okay.
Anyway, and it came down to me and someone else, and I didn't get the job. And I was, at the time, being devastated. I was like, I had all this experience. How could I not get the job? It came down to me and one other person. And I remember Chris telling me, this happened for a reason and you'll be fine. And thank God it did in many ways, because then I never would have had the opportunity to go work for Rahm Emanuel. And if I never had the opportunity to work for Rahm Emanuel, I never would have had the opportunity to go in the White House. And so I'm a big believer in sometimes, things that happen at the moment feel like such a challenge, but it just, one, kind of, makes you stronger, but then two, does set you up for success. You just got to keep on going at it.
So, and you and I are both, I'm not nearly as, but close with Chris Jennings, who is one of these Uber Washington folks that are one of the best people. Damn it, we're being recorded. I can't say any more nice things about it.
I'm going to tell him you said that.
But yeah, Chris, you worked under a very bright star, which helped a lot of doors. And
he set a very high bar, to be honest. I mean, it was also really good life skills of, I think also working for people who were very demanding in a positive way set a very high bar for me to achieve. And that really pushed me, I think, in how I take on every job and every challenge I face.
And in thinking about it in terms of those things you want to bring, I mean, it is what would you say is those types of things? I mean, work ethic, the communications. What are those things, those skills that you feel like that you're advising younger people? I mean, what are the things you have to really try to be successful in this space?
Well, I think a lot of it also comes down to some of the things we talked about already, is just treat people with respect. And treat everyone, whether it's I always tell clients who are walking into lobby office, you treat the person who's the chief of staff or the member of Congress, you treat the staff assistant who greets you just as much respect as you would the chief of staff or the member of Congress. One, it's just a polite thing to do. And two, that staff assistant will probably be a chief of staff in about a year or two. So it's always in your best interest just to treat people with respect. So I think that's one. But two, it's also just in how you work across the aisle and how you work with your colleagues. If you're always trying to be the smartest person in the room, you're going to miss something. And so I really prided myself in through, all of my jobs to really, bridge the aisle, bridge the gap. I mean, Rodney, you and I obviously have very different political philosophies, but we're great friends and we can have those conversations and we work together. And even when we were, even at the worst moments when you were sending me subpoenas over things like healthcare.gov and your oversight letters, not quite subpoenas, but you can still have very cordial professional relationships even if you disagree. And I think that doesn't happen as much in Washington as it used to. And I think that's really important. So I think it's that. And then I think ultimately it's the work ethic thing. Just work hard. No one's interested in you having the best, greatest, most amazing idea. It's how hard you work and how you treat people. And so I think those are really critically important skills. And the final thing I say, I think being a good writer is just critically important, being successful in any job you do, but having really strong writing skills I can't underscore how important that is.
Yeah, if you're nothing but black ink on white paper and that's what people see of you first, writing well jumps out every time. Before they've ever seen you, before they've ever gotten a resume, a reference for you. I mean, if they can see that, somebody can tell that's a skill, and that's a really important. So Shannon and Brian, it's approaching the point in time where we would kick in and open up Q&A, and we're happy to touch anything under the sun, inclusive of, hey, is there an election in a couple of days? Can it get here fast enough? Open to all conversations, so you guys jump in.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us, and Rodney for guiding the conversation. So Lauren, we have a couple of questions about the ACA. And so we may as well start there. So we're going to take you back a couple spots.
Okay. I wish I had some wine.
I actually said the same thing right before I started. So there's one question that asks, how do you think the constitutionality of the ACA is going to play out next month? And I guess I would just also add to that, how do you even think ahead to that decision?
It's a great question. Now this will be the third time we're going through a Supreme Court, hearing on an aspect of the ACA. To be honest, I don't pontificate on it. I don't try to say, here's what I think is going to happen, because to be honest, you just never know how the court's going to rule. Going back even to 2012, if you had said to me that ACA will be upheld, but the Medicaid expansion will be struck down, no one ever would have saw that. So, I'll be interested to see how the oral arguments go in 2 weeks now, a week and a half. I continue to hold out hope that we've survived twice now and we'll survive a third time. I'm hopeful that Joe Biden will win next week and Democrats take back the Senate, so that if, a ruling comes down, which won't happen until, next June, July, Democrats will be in a position to deal with the ruling. But it's a very challenging question. And I think that there's some policy, questions of, do you just add a severability clause, which is something that means that just the mandate piece would fall, but the rest of the law would stay intact. And the reality is the mandate has been zeroed out anyway, so that wouldn't have a really practical effect. There are some conversations of, do you take the mandate back up to $1 or $2 just to make the point? I don't expect Congress to necessarily legislate on that. If Joe Biden wins in the Senate, Democrats prevail, that's something they would address in January. I think there's some question about waiting till the court rules to see what you're actually dealing with. But I do think we'll see, ACA improvements just broadly on some of the shortcomings of the law dealing with more affordability if Democrats can take back the Senate and the presidency.
And just a quick comment about that. Of the three challenges, I think most people who are judicial observers would say this is easily the weakest of the three challenges, but thousands of people can think that. Only 9 people matter.
Right, and we have a different court than we did going back a couple of years and going back to 2012.
Yeah,
absolutely. So one last on the ACA, and then I'll turn it over to Brian. You mentioned that when you were in the midst of all of that work, that there were some things that you would have liked to look different. What would be one of those things?
It's a good question. God, there are several. I mean, I wish that, well, at the end of the day, when the ACA finally became law, so what happened basically is that we had a House product we had a Senate product, and then we spent January merging the two bills. So we have there's a product that was a merged bill that was about 95% done and never saw daylight, because at that point Senator Ted Kennedy had passed away, and we had a Senate seat up in Massachusetts, and then the Democrats lost, which means we went from 60 votes in the Senate to 59. So somewhere in the archives of President Obama, there's a draft bill that never became, that was really dealing with 95% of a merged bill and a merged approach that would have, I think, dealt with a lot of challenges we were facing. One, obviously, severability, high severability clause. I think that's one. Two is issues about making some of the premium tax credits more affordable. Obviously we're dealing with some budgetary issues there, but I think trying to get more dollars to provide services would have been, I think, impactful. I would have loved to have seen right now the premium tax credits only go to people who make 400% of poverty. I grew up in New York. 400% of poverty is, that's still not a lot of money. I know it's different in Southern Virginia, but it's still where you live. It's not enough to really survive in many places for a family of four. So I think having a little bit more subsidies there would have been impactful. One issue that really still riles me, which Rodney and I get to work on now, has to deal with prescription drugs. When we set up in the ACA, we had, right now, the most drugs that are coming to market are biologics. And so they're incredibly expensive. So the ACA set up a pathway to allow biosimilars to come to market. The exclusivity is associated with those biosimilars. The president's position, which I crafted, was 7 years. So you get 7 years of exclusivity before a competitor can come in. What Congress ultimately decided was they were going to have 14 years. Right. And we went round and round and round and round and round, even with President Obama directly about it. And that was one of the things that I thought was one of the worst policies we had in the ACA. And we're seeing how it plays out now, because we have very few biosimilars on market. We've gotten a few more in the last couple of years, but not a ton. And that's partially because of the exclusivity.
Right. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'm sure there are more, but those are the big ones that stick out.
Yep, that's great.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a wonky question. And so this question is for Lauren or Rodney, whoever wants to take it. I want to come back to a point made earlier about the government controlling drug prices, or at least the proposal for something like that, and scaling them to international prices. So correct me if I'm wrong, but current federal law prohibits the government from negotiating drug prices directly with drug companies. So this is the Medicare reform. And
you should ask Rodney about that provision, because I think he worked on it.
Tom Dashiell's bill first, but anyway.
Well, okay.
Rodney's still on non-interference clause in MMA. Were you a finance teacher then?
No.
You weren't?
Nope, not 2 years later.
Okay, my apologies. My apologies. It was Rodney's boss, though. Just for
Thank you. Okay.
So, all right. Well, Rodney, now you're on the spot. So, if Congress was to change that that restriction, what impact do you think that would have on lowering drug prices?
It's a how portion. The how part is the question, which is it's that a manufacturer can say, we want the price to be X. Sovaldi, on a new drug right off the market, that this is our price, $84,000 for a run of the treatment. That their ability to be able to say, we'll take 84,000 and we'll get 84,000, and that's the end of this conversation. That once you change that, the government comes in, that they just lose that authority. And I think the question is, and I know that we deal with it for those of us in drug pricing, is that there's not a well-developed conversation dealing with, okay, then what are the consequences of that? I mean, does Gilead come to the market if they know they can only get 80,000 or 60,000 or 40,000 for run a treatment? I mean, there's a legitimate conversation to be had there, but their ability to be able to say whatever they want and that we're going to get that, if you take that away, you have to have that conversation. Lauren, you add to that in any way?
Well, I mean, obviously, we right now work with a lot of different people who are not fans of the policy. I'd say, but based on my experiences, I do think that these manufacturers want the market share of the government. And so they're not going to not play because of the government having a role.
Yeah.
When you think about the number of lives involved, tens of millions in Medicare, Medicaid, it's too big of a market and to not play.
Yeah.
Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, we have a student, Desiree, who is in Intro to Public Health right now, who is asking about the relationship between these kinds of drug pricing policies and social determinants of health. So are there certain kinds of drugs that we know are used for diseases that are more likely to affect certain populations? Are they negotiated differently based on things like race, socioeconomic status, et cetera? Are those things that are on the surface? Are they down below? Do they come up at all?
So great question. I think broadly, there's a lot of conversation right now happening in Washington about social determinants of health, whether it be, food deserts or transportation, heating, housing. It's in DC, we have hot topics. It is certainly a very hot topic right now. And I think there's generally a bipartisan desire to try to figure out ways to address social determinants of health. Your question is phenomenal. I don't think many people have thought about the context of trying to do outreach from a drug pricing perspective, particularly to minority communities. But obviously, in dealing with healthcare disparities, and we've seen that through the COVID crisis more so than ever, is something that Congress needs to address and stakeholders need to address. I think one challenge that we've seen for quite some time with new drugs coming to market is that when manufacturers are doing, clinical trials, there's certainly not enough minorities represented. And obviously we know that lots of people react differently to different kinds of drugs. So making sure moving forward in all of these policy areas, the minorities are really well represented is going to be critical to the success of not only dealing with just drugs generally, but making sure that we're dealing with some of the core issues for social determinants of health.
For people who are eligible for the Medicaid program, there certainly is limitations on costs that people face there from prescription drugs, but talking about in terms of the integration into any other aspect of health or social determinants generally, that's a much different conversation, and it's one that does not go on yet.
All right, so our next question, we obviously have a lot of students, I almost said in the audience, but you know what I mean. Gotcha. To someone who's interested in this kind of career, how would you recommend getting started? What can students be doing right now to prepare for a similar kind of career path?
You want to go first, Rodney, or do you want
No, a lot of them may have heard this from me, so go ahead.
Well, one, I'm going to say go vote. I mean, that's so you should go vote. Even if you go for someone I don't agree with, go vote. I think it's a really important skill. But I also think just getting involved in your local communities is important. Really understanding kind of the issues facing your communities, I think, is critically important. And then you can always obviously go work on Capitol Hill. It's a great place to start. But I think so many people rush to go work on Capitol Hill, not really. And I met 1,000 people who are like, they want to run for office. And the question is, and I sit down and I, to be honest, never wanted to run for office. But why? And I think really understanding what drives people, it can't just be about the politics of it. You want to come do it to approach and to address some issue. And so trying to figure out what that issue is that you want to effectuate changes, I think is really critically important. And so having kind of that knowledge base and that desire and having a sense of what you want to do, I think is really critical to success. And then two, but I do think, obviously there's a wealth of opportunity, not only in Washington, but outside of Washington, whether you're working, if you're a local city council, your local mayor, whether it be the state legislature, those are all incredible opportunities that will just help you think through both and learn. I mean, I always joke that, Rodney and I are federal lobbyists, but federal lobbying is a lot different than lobbying at the state level. And so to have kind of a broad perspective, I think certainly helps. And so, the Capitol is going to be there for hopefully for the democracy continues for hundreds of years. And so it will always be there. And it's definitely an incredible experience to go work on Capitol Hill, but that doesn't mean it has to be the be all end all of opportunity. So I definitely think there are lots of ways to start on career paths in local areas.
I'll throw 3 things in real quick. Whatever you're doing, whatever opportunity you get, work really hard, do it really, really well.
Yeah.
Second, while you're there, have an eye out for that thing that you think you could do next, that is that thing you want to do. Learn about the other opportunities around you, and then be thinking about, okay, maybe there's something out there in 5 years I could be doing. I can't do it now, but that's something I'd want to do. Always have your mind open to those, but never forget what I said first. which is whatever you're doing, do it really well, because if you don't, you'll never make those next 2 steps.
But I also think I agree with all of that too, but also keeping your eyes open to new opportunities, because you may have your pathway set in your mind, but that's not the way life works.
Yeah.
And so you're never, like if you had said to me when I was 22, I was going to go work in a White House when I was 30, there's just no way that was going to happen. So in some ways, I think it's being open to new experiences, but then also, having, maybe this is more of a generational thing, and I don't want to sound like I'm too old, but I feel like a lot of us were brought up to pay your dues and work really hard. And I think those are critically important skills that Rodney talked about, but always people are going to remember how you operate in the role you have at the moment. And that's critically important, I think, doing well later down the road.
Yeah, just real quickly, I wanted to be in Miller Hall teaching political science at 30, so that didn't turn out.
Failed.
I just want to say, for the students who are watching, if you did not hear Lauren, you need to go back and listen to what she said. Because I whenever possible, I try to encourage students to intern or do something in local government or state government, instead of just rushing to DC, because you can get some really great kind of experiences.
Totally. One of my first internships was actually working when I was in high school for the New York City comptroller, which I didn't even know what that was. But it was an office in New York City that handled the finances, and I did very little, to be honest, having any finances, but I was in the community relations office, and I got to go see how he interacted with various communities across the city. And I volunteered in his campaign, and that led me then to go work for Chuck Schumer in the mid-90s when he was a congressman running for Senate, and I volunteered in his campaign. And it was just a great, but again, it's the New York City comptroller. And so who knows, no one outside of New York City knows who that is or what the job entails, but it was a great experience.
Well, and those opportunities, maybe not the New York City comptroller, exist in Salem.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I'm sure they do.
We have an alumnus who is the legislative assistant locally for our local representative.
Mm-hmm.
And those are connections that we can help you with. So please talk to Brian, talk to Dr. Parsons, talk to me, talk to your other professors, and we can really help with that first step. We can't get you on the hill maybe, but we can do the first steps.
But there's so much to be learned, I think, from, serving your local communities.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely. Well, we have just a couple minutes left. Should we do this?
Find the toughest question, throw it at us.
So there's one that's a follow-up to what you talked about with insulin. Will the reclassification of insulin as a biologic earlier this year allow the market to lead to lower prices, or will the patent system and other systems in place prevent that change?
So I don't think that actually became law, but that was the policy piece I was talking about that was in the Lower Cost Act.
Uh-huh.
Or actually, Rodney, did it become law?
I don't think it did, but now I gotta want to go look too.
No,
Was this pre-COVID? I mean, because that was.
we should go back and check, and maybe clearly the student who asked the question clearly knows the issue well, which is fantastic. If memory serves, I think it's in the Lower Cost Act that did not become law but passed. Oh God, no, it may become law now. God.
You all said to throw a tough question.
No, it was a good one.
Here we are.
I think actually, now I think about it, I think it did become law. Actually, you're right, it did. So there, and now it's coming back to me. We should have done this at 7 o'clock in the morning when I was more caffeinated. It did. It was part of one of the deals that happened around Christmas last year. I'm thinking of a different provision in a Lower Cost Healthcare Act. So go back to the question though. I think there are competing schools of thought about whether or not it's reclassified as a biologic now will actually mean there are lower cost alternatives that will come to market sooner. Because if I remember correctly, part of the issue has to do with when the clock starts when you submit your application. And that is part of the challenge.
And that's some complicated FDA stuff.
Yeah. Again, I needed more coffee for that one, but whoever remembered that it became law, hats off to you. Well done. You can come intern for us.
Excellent. Well, I believe we are at the end of our time for tonight. We do have more questions, and maybe we can share those with you, Lauren,
Sure.
after we're off. But
Yes,
thank you
questions for the record, right?
so much. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll close us out here. So again, thank you so much to Lauren and Rodney for this conversation. This has really been really great. And thanks to everybody who joined us tonight for NOKELive from DC. We invite you to join us for upcoming NOKELive events, including next week's Bingo Night with former chaplain Paul Henriksen and current chaplain Chris Bowen. There are 3 more events after Bingo that will focus on 15 years of Our House projects and a look at the Inside Out Prison Project, and then an evening with the Roanoke College Choir. For more information, visit roanoke.edu/alumni and visit the Alumni Hub. There you can find links to upcoming and past NOKELive events. And also please check out the Roanoke College main webpage for other online events. Take care, everyone. Stay well, and thanks for tuning in tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.